For decades, Windows users have been told a familiar story. Linux is powerful, sure, but it's complicated. It's only for programmers, sysadmins, or people who enjoy typing cryptic commands into a black terminal window. It's not ready for normal users. It's not practical for daily work. It's not polished. It's always almost there, but never quite ready to replace Windows on a personal machine. That story used to have some truth to it. But here's the part many Windows users haven't realized yet. That version of Linux is gone. Quietly, steadily, and without much marketing noise, Linux has crossed into territory that Windows users are simply not prepared for. Not because Linux copied Windows, but because it moved in directions Windows cannot easily follow anymore. What Linux can do now isn't just about performance or customization, though those are still strong advantages. It's about control, predictability, efficiency, privacy, and long-term stability in a computing world that increasingly feels chaotic on the Windows side. Windows users have slowly adapted to forced updates, growing system requirements, background services they didn't ask for, telemetry they can't fully disable, and design changes that often feel disconnected from how people actually use their machines. Many accepted these changes as the cost of modern computing. Linux, meanwhile, took a different path. Modern Linux desktops no longer feel like experimental projects stitched together by volunteers. They feel intentional, polished, mature. Desktop environments like GNOME, KDE Plasma, Cinnamon, and others now offer experiences that rival, and in some cases exceed, Windows in terms of usability. Animations are smooth. Scaling works correctly on high-resolution displays. Touchpads behave naturally, and multi-monitor setups are far more reliable than they used to be. For Windows users accustomed to wrestling with display settings, driver quirks, or random UI inconsistencies after updates, this alone can feel shocking. But the real surprise is how little effort Linux now demands from the user. Installation used to be a major barrier. Partitioning disks, choosing file systems, and worrying about bootloaders scared people away. Today, most mainstream Linux distributions install as easily as Windows, sometimes more easily. The installer walks you through a few simple choices, handles disk setup automatically, and finishes in minutes. On many systems, Linux boots faster out of the box than a freshly installed Windows system, without any tweaking. Once installed, the idea that Linux requires constant terminal use no longer holds up. Yes, the terminal is still there, and it's incredibly powerful for those who want it. But for daily tasks, you rarely need it. Software installation happens through graphical app stores. Updates happen in the background, or with a single click. System settings are centralized, cleanly organized, and consistent. Windows users often don't realize how fragmented Windows settings have become until they experience a Linux desktop where everything lives in one coherent place. One of the biggest shocks for Windows users is how calm Linux feels. Windows has become noisy. Notifications for updates, restarts, cloud sign-ins, promotions, security warnings, and feature announcements constantly interrupt the experience. Linux doesn't behave this way. Updates are respectful. You decide when to apply them. Restarts are rarely forced. The system doesn't nag you to create an online account, subscribe to services, or enable features you didn't ask for. That sense of calm changes how people relate to their computers. The machine feels like a tool again, not a platform constantly asking for attention. Performance is another area where Windows users are often unprepared for what Linux can do now. On modern hardware, Linux feels responsive and light. On older hardware, it can feel miraculous. Machines that struggle to run the latest version of Windows smoothly often feel reborn under Linux. Boot times shrink. Applications launch faster. Background resource usage drops dramatically. This isn't magic. It's the result of systems designed to be modular, efficient, and free from layers of legacy components that Windows must carry forward for compatibility. Windows users are used to upgrading hardware to keep up with software. Linux flips that relationship. The software adapts to the hardware, not the other way around. Lightweight desktops, minimal services, and efficient memory management allow Linux to scale down as easily as it scales up. For people with older laptops, budget systems, or even modern machines they want to keep fast for years, this is a revelation. Then there's control. Windows users often don't realize how much control they've lost over time. Updates install when Windows decides they should. Features appear and disappear. System behavior changes after major updates. Settings move. Defaults reset. With Linux, control stays with the user. You choose when to update. You choose what gets installed. You choose which services run, nothing changes without your consent. That sense of ownership fundamentally alters the computing experience. Privacy is another area where Windows users are increasingly uneasy. Telemetry data collection and cloud integration are deeply embedded in modern Windows versions. While some of it can be reduced, much of it cannot be fully disabled. Linux operates on a different philosophy. Most Linux distributions collect little to no telemetry by default. When they do, it's usually optional and clearly disclosed. There's no advertising ID, no background syncing to a corporate cloud unless you explicitly set it up. For users who value digital privacy, this alone can justify the switch. Software availability is no longer the barrier it once was either. Windows users often assume Linux lacks applications. In reality, the landscape has changed dramatically. Web-based apps have leveled the playing field. Browsers, email, document editing, design tools, project management, and communication platforms work the same everywhere. For native applications, Linux now has strong options across categories. Office suites, creative tools, development environments, media players, and utilities are readily available. Gaming, once considered impossible on Linux, has advanced rapidly. Compatibility layers, native ports, and platform support have transformed Linux into a viable gaming system for many users. What often surprises Windows users most is how consistent Linux feels over time. A Linux system installed today can remain stable and familiar for years. Major updates rarely break workflows. Interfaces don't radically change without warning. Features aren't removed arbitrarily. This predictability contrasts sharply with the Windows update cycle, where major releases can feel like learning a new operating system every few years. Linux values continuity. It respects muscle memory. Security on Linux also works differently, and in many ways more transparently. Windows users are used to antivirus software, background scans, pop-ups, and system slowdowns tied to security processes. Linux relies more heavily on system design, permissions, and package management to maintain security. Software comes from trusted repositories, system files are protected. Malware targeting Linux desktops exists, but it's far less prevalent, and the overall attack surface is smaller for typical users. Security feels built in rather than bolted on. Customization is another area where Linux quietly surpasses Windows. Windows allows limited personalization, but most of the system remains locked down. Linux, by contrast, is infinitely adaptable. You can change the look, behavior, shortcuts, workflows, and even fundamental components of the system. But here's the part Windows users aren't ready for. You don't have to customize anything if you don't want to. Modern Linux defaults are good. Customization is an option, not a requirement. This optional depth is key to understanding why Linux is different now. It meets users where they are. If you want a simple, appliance-like system, Linux can be that. If you want a deeply customized power user environment, Linux can be that too. Windows increasingly forces everyone into the same experience, regardless of how they actually work. Another underappreciated shift is how Linux handles software updates. Instead of each application managing its own updater, Linux centralizes updates. The system, drivers, and applications update together. This reduces conflicts, improves stability, and saves time. Windows users accustomed to juggling multiple updaters, restart prompts, and version conflicts often find this approach refreshingly efficient. Linux has also benefited from the slow decline of the traditional desktop software monopoly. Cloud services, cross-platform frameworks, and open standards have reduced Windows' advantage. File formats are more open. Browsers are more capable. Collaboration happens online. Linux fits naturally into this world because it was built on open standards from the start. The perception gap is perhaps the biggest reason Windows users aren't ready for what Linux can do now. Many people are reacting to an outdated image of Linux from 10 or 15 years ago. They imagine broken drivers, poor Wi-Fi support, ugly interfaces, and endless troubleshooting. While no system is perfect, modern Linux distributions handle hardware remarkably well. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, printers, webcams, and audio devices often work out of the box. And when they don't, the solutions are usually well documented and stable. What's changed isn't just Linux itself, but the ecosystem around it. Documentation is better. Communities are more welcoming, tutorials are clearer. Problems that once required deep technical knowledge now have simple, user-friendly solutions. Linux has grown up. There's also a philosophical shift that Windows users may not consciously notice at first. Linux doesn't treat the user as a product. It doesn't exist to push services, gather data, or lock users into ecosystems. It exists to run software efficiently and reliably. That difference shows up everywhere, from system design to user experience. Once users feel that difference, it's hard to unsee it. For professionals, Linux has become increasingly attractive. Developers, designers, engineers, and researchers appreciate how Linux integrates seamlessly with modern workflows. Tools are readily available. The environment is predictable. Automation is powerful. Even non-technical professionals benefit from a system that stays out of the way and lets them focus on their work. The idea that Linux is fragmented or confusing also deserves re-examination. While choice can be overwhelming, it's also a strength. Different distributions serve different needs. Some prioritize stability, others prioritize cutting-edge features. Some mimic familiar interfaces. Others experiment with new ideas. Windows users are used to a single path. Linux offers options without forcing them. Perhaps the most important realization for Windows users is that Linux no longer needs to replace Windows to be valuable. It can coexist. Dual booting, virtual machines, and secondary devices make experimenting easy. Many users start small, using Linux for specific tasks, then gradually rely on it more as confidence grows. Over time, Windows becomes the secondary system, not the primary one. What Linux can do now is not about flashy features or marketing claims. It's about delivering a computing experience that feels respectful, efficient, and stable in a time when many users feel burned out by constant change. It's about giving users back a sense of agency over their machines. It's about proving that an operating system can improve without demanding more attention, more data, or more hardware. Windows users aren't ready for this because they've been trained to expect a certain kind of friction. They've accepted that computers are slow, noisy, and intrusive. Linux challenges that assumption. It shows that computing can be quiet, predictable, fast, personal. That realization can be unsettling, especially when it comes from a platform long dismissed as not ready. Linux didn't suddenly become better overnight. It improved gradually, intentionally, and often invisibly. While Windows chased features, services, and integrations, Linux focused on fundamentals, stability, efficiency, control. Those fundamentals now matter more than ever. As more users quietly discover this, the conversation around operating systems will continue to change. Not because Linux is trying to conquer the desktop, but because it offers an alternative that feels increasingly sane. For Windows users who haven't looked at Linux in years, the surprise isn't that Linux works. The surprise is how well it works, how little it asks of you, and how much it gives back in return. That's what Windows users aren't ready for. Not a flashy revolution, but a calm, confident evolution that makes you question why you tolerated so much friction for so long.